He said, if you took the state of Texas and covered it in silver dollars 2 feet deep, you marked one of those silver dollars and you blindfolded a man and you told him that he could go as far as he wanted to east, as far as he wanted to the west, as far as he wanted to the north or to the south, but at some point he's got to bend over and pick up one of those silver dollars. The chances that he would pick up the silver dollar that is marked are the chances that 8 of these prophecies would be fulfilled in any one person. The overall big picture thing I want you to see in this session is this. More than 300 prophecies were fulfilled in the life and ministry of Jesus. More than 300. Now I want to say a couple of things before we dive into the specific types of prophecies and different things. First of all, we're not going to cover 300 prophecies tonight. I did not list all 300 prophecies. You can find lists out there and go through those if you'd like. But I'd also want to remind us about the nature of prophecy. We talked about this in last session. The nature of prophecy is that it needs to be clear enough so that when it happens, you know that that is the event that it's referring to. But there's also a level of obscurity to it. It needs to be obscure enough that you don't really see how it's actually going to work out until it does. So it's like a puzzle piece. A puzzle piece is missing. You can't quite picture what that puzzle piece is, but when you put it in there, you say, yes, that is it. There's nothing else it could be. It fits perfectly. Why does it have to be obscure? Some of it needs to be obscure because if it wasn't obscure, people would bend the events of history to match the prophecies. And so it has to be just obscure enough that it's not prehistory. That's not what prophecy is. It's not pre-recorded history. Some people want that. And some people say, well, because I don't see pre-recorded history in Scripture, then I reject that these prophecies are actually true about Jesus. Here's the deal. We looked in last session at some prophecies that do get really specific that are almost like prehistory. They're told in prophetic wording. They use symbolic language. But when you get through the symbols, which are very obvious and apparent, they're not hidden, mysterious symbols. It's very obvious what they're talking about. When you get through that, it's so clear what is going to happen from that point forward in history. Well, then what do people say? People say, well, that must have been written after it happened. So even when people have what they say they're asking for, this kind of prehistory kind of prophecy, then they find another reason to reject it. The other thing I want to say about these 300 prophecies is 300 prophecies, there's 300 prophecies. There's a lot of words in the Bible. So what that there's 300 prophecies. This is tremendous. It's a tremendous amount of prophecies about any person or event. There is no other person or event in the history of the world, in any place, anywhere, that has anything near 300 prophecies that have been fulfilled in the same way that Jesus has had them fulfilled. There was a statistician named Peter Stoner, and he took he just chose 8 of the prophecies. 8 of the prophecies that are fairly well agreed upon that Jesus actually did these things. And so he took these 8 prophecies and he ran the probability that that those 8 prophecies would be fulfilled in any one person. So what are the chances? Maybe it just so happens that if history moves on long enough, that eventually somebody would fulfill all 300 of these prophecies. Maybe that person just happened to be Jesus, and now we've exalted him to be something that he's really not. And maybe it's just that it was eventually going to happen in some person. So Peter Stoner took the science of probability and applied it to this idea of prophecy. And he determined that the chances that any 8, now we're talking about 300, he said that any 8 of these prophecies would be fulfilled in a single person was 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Now, unless you're really into math, you don't understand how astronomically large that number is. That is a massive number. So he gives a great illustration. It's one of my favorite illustrations. He said, if you took the state of Texas and covered it in silver dollars 2 feet deep. Got the picture? The entire state of Texas covered in silver dollars up to 2 feet. You marked one of those silver dollars and you blindfolded a man and you told him that he could go as far as he wanted to east, as far as he wanted to the west, as far as he wanted to the north or to the south, but at some point he's got to bend over and pick up one of those silver dollars. the chances that he would pick up the silver dollar that is marked are the chances that 8 of these prophecies would be fulfilled in any one person. So when you look at the probability of this, it is astronomical that it would be fulfilled in any one person. So those who argue against these prophecies, they can't deal with the fact that they've been fulfilled. They have to find some way to say that they weren't really fulfilled in Jesus, which becomes a problem when you have 300 of them. So you might be able to find, and we'll see some tonight, and I'll tell you in some ways how people will say, well, this prophecy wasn't really fulfilled in him, or how they kind of get around or work around that particular prophecy. But when you get to 300 prophecies, it gets harder and harder to do that over and over again, and it gets more difficult to believe that anybody worked this hard to put together this big of a con job, because that's what it would have to be. 300 prophecies, and you all try to make them work into the life of Jesus. So let's talk about some of the prophecies. The first is the promise of the Messiah. This is maybe my favorite prophecy. It's my favorite prophecy because of the timing of it. God has just confronted Adam and Eve in their sin. He is judging them. He is saying to them, you are going to be cursed because of the sin that you have committed. And in the middle of speaking about the curse, He gives us the first glimmer of hope. So He doesn't wait until, well, they've had some time to think about how bad this is all going to be. I'll come back and tell them there's some hope. He rolls it right into the curse. It's actually part of the curse statement, and there's hope in the curse statement. So Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, He says, the Lord God said to the serpent. I included that for you so you know who He's speaking to. But then verse 15 picks up, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now I want to point out some things that we know out of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. God has promised that someone will come. So what is it that we know about the promised one just from Genesis 3:15? If we had no other prophecy, what would we look at this passage and understand? First, we would understand that this promised one would be a human. Well, you might take that for granted, but think of all the different ways that God could have said He would undo the work of the devil, the work of Satan. He could send an angel. He could create another special being. He could send any kind of being He wants to. It could be another animal. We think of it as, well, of course He's going to be a human because that's all we've ever thought of. But at first He says, okay, your work today is going to be undone by a human. There's so much theological significance behind that, but we won't go into that. Just I want you to see that the promised one will be a human. Not only would the promised one be a human, but the promised one would be a man. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So now, out of all the humans that would ever be born, roughly 50% of them are taken out of this picture, right? This is going to be a man. Now, God could have done this through a woman, but He said, I'm going to do this through a man. So, the promised one would be a man. The promised one would be the offspring or seed of the woman. Now, without going into technical detail, the seed, and that's the word. So offspring here is given to you in some of your English versions to distinguish between when this word is used to speak about a human and when this word is used to speak about the seed of a plant. So some of your translations, mine included, will say offspring, and then the same word will be translated seed when it's speaking about a plant. And that's to help us understand as readers which one that the author is speaking about. But the word is the same, and it refers to the man's contribution to the reproductive process. So the seed of the woman doesn't really even make sense. The seed of the woman, the offspring of the woman, the one coming from the woman will bruise your head. And you will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There are other times that this phrase, the seed of the woman, or a reference to a woman's seed is used in the Old Testament, but I want to share with you every single time because I want to point out something. So once it's used in Genesis chapter 16, verse 10 to refer to Hagar. Hagar gave birth to Abraham's son Ishmael, and this is when she was cast out by Sarah. So Sarah finds out that she is expecting a child and kicks her out. So she's out all by herself, alone, and God says to her, your seed, your offspring, is going to become a great nation. But I want you to notice she is separated from Abraham at this point. So Abraham is not involved in the life of this, the future life of this great nation. There's a separation there. She's been cast out of his house. Rebekah, who married Abraham's son Isaac, as she's leaving, her brothers celebrate that she's leaving, and they pray this prayer of blessing over her, and they say, may your offspring be greatly blessed. So they are speaking to her as she's going out to meet Isaac and eventually be Isaac's wife. And so Isaac is not in the picture yet. These people don't know Isaac. Rebekah is the only one in the picture at this point. It's used of women accused and subsequently cleared of adultery, and it's speaking of their ability to have children. So that's in Numbers chapter 5, verse 28, where the Bible tells us that this woman now has been cleared of adultery, and she will be able to now produce children. And so again, this is not about the man and the woman. This is about the woman only because of the situation where she's been accused of adultery. It's used of widowed daughters of priests when considering whether or not they should be allowed to eat the priest's food. So if they have married a non-priest and they have had a child, then they are not allowed to eat the priest's food, because now that child is a male son, is a male child, is supposed to now provide for them, and they are no longer part of the priest's allotment. But if they married a non-priest, so they left the priest family, but they did not have a male son, they are now still allowed to eat of the priest's food. So again, the husband is not involved. So it speaks of the woman's offspring because there's not a husband involved. And then the last time it's used is 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11 of Hannah. When Hannah prays, and she prays for a son. She asks God to give her a son. And at this point, she's not been able to have a child, and she needs God to miraculously intervene and give her a child. So I want you to notice about all these situations that they're not common situations. They're all different situations, and in most of them, a man has been removed from the picture for one reason or another. Well, then it goes back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So what does that tell us about God saying to Eve, or saying to the serpent, the seed of the woman? Why does he say the seed of the woman? Well, Adam is overlooked. Adam is overlooked in this prophecy, and there's no immediate reason to exclude Adam. Adam's not dead, he's not gone, he's not divorced Eve or left her. He's right there involved in the picture. So why is Adam excluded? His exclusion points forward to the unique nature of the Messiah's birth. In other words, it points forward to the virgin birth. Now that's not to say that Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 tells us that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, but it does kind of hint at it, doesn't it? The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. Okay, that's different than what we expect him to say. We expect him to say, the seed of the man, the offspring of the man, will crush the head of the serpent. So it tells us that a unique birth is going to take place of a human male, and it also tells us that this promised one would destroy the serpent and his work. He will crush your head. He will undo what you've done here today. And it tells us that in the process, he himself will be harmed. That's all in Genesis chapter 3. So if we didn't have anything other than Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 recorded 1,500 years or so before Jesus was born, we would have to step back and say, this seems to be remarkably accurate according to the New Testament's description of the life and ministry and death of Jesus. And that's all from one verse. That's the very first promise and prophecy regarding the Messiah. When we look at the genealogy of the Messiah next, this is very powerful to me too. Adrian Rogers used to compare this to dialing a phone number. I know we don't do this anymore. We open our phones and we hit send, or we tell our smart devices who to call or that kind of thing. But remember, you used to have to dial a phone. Anybody remember that? You put your finger in the hole, pull it, and so if you're making a long distance call, the first thing you do is you dial the number of the country. So if you're calling the United States, you put in 1 and you hit 1. Well, that eliminates all other countries. So now you know you're calling someone in the United States. Then you put in the 251. Well, that eliminates about 3/4 of the state of Alabama. It eliminates all other states. So now we've gone from the nation down to the state of Alabama, down to about 3/4 of the state. Well, then you put in 661, and that actually brings us to Mobile and eliminates a good chunk of the city of Mobile. We're narrowing in. Then when you put in those last 4 numbers, every number eliminates thousands of people until the phone rings here at this church. And so every time there's a narrowing. Well, that's what happens with the prophecies about the genealogy of Jesus. So we've already seen Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 that the Messiah would be a male human. We also see in Genesis chapter 12 verse 3 the Messiah would be a descendant of Abraham. So we've gone from all humans, now we're to all the descendants of Abraham. So the Messiah is going to be one of the descendants of Abraham. Genesis chapter 17 verses 18 through 19, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac, not Ishmael. Abraham actually asks, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you fulfill your promise through Ishmael? God says, no, it will be through Isaac. Well, then Isaac has 2 children, Jacob and Esau. Genesis chapter 25, verse 23 tells us that the prophecy of the Messiah, of the blessing of all the nations through the descendants of Abraham, that it will come through Jacob and not through Esau. Then we get it limited even further because Jacob has 12 sons. And in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, the Bible tells us, in fact, let's look at that one. So turn to Genesis chapter 49. I want you to see it. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, the Bible says there are 12 sons, and the Messiah will come through one of those sons. Now, the reason that I'm interested so much in this prophecy is if you were reading up to this point about Jacob's 12 sons, and you were choosing which one would be Messiah material, you'd choose Joseph. Joseph is the hero of the story leading up to these chapters. And Jacob, as he is blessing his sons, is giving this blessing out, and he goes through each one of them and he gives some kind of statement that is somewhat prophetic about the way that son's life will go and even the tribe that will come from that son's life. And then in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, I want to warn you there are several different translations of this. I'm reading from the ESV. The Bible says, the scepter, that's the ruler's staff, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Some of your translations say something a little different. Why? Because of the Septuagint. So there are a couple of different ways that the Hebrew words can go here. So there are some clarifications made in the Septuagint, and some of your translations pick up on those clarifications. Now keep in mind, the Septuagint is translated before Jesus comes. So the Septuagint is translated pre-Christ. And the Septuagint gives this more direct meaning even. So already it's messianic. The scepter's going to Judah. That's going to be the tribe that produces the rulers. And then it will come to him, singular, individual. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Well, that's already extremely messianic. To me, that's enough to read it and say, that is pointing us to the fact that the Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah. But the Septuagint clarification makes it even more messianic. It makes it to say, to the one that it belongs to. It's coming back to the one it belongs to. So there's even more messianic idea behind that. So now we're down from, he's going to be a human, he'll be from Abraham through Isaac, not Ishmael. He'll be from Isaac through Jacob, not Esau. He will be from Jacob through Judah, not any of his other sons. And then finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and Isaiah 11:1, and that's where I want us to look next. So turn to Isaiah 11:1. I want you to see that. The Messiah would be a descendant through Judah of one particular member of the tribe of Judah, and that is David. So the Messiah is going to come from the house of David. So that's the genealogy of the Messiah. Now, by the time you get to Matthew chapter 1, we skip over that genealogy because we think it's boring. That genealogy is exciting for more reasons other than the women who are listed in it. That does make it an interesting genealogy, but there's so much more to it. It's literally a record of God fulfilling everything He said He was going to do in all of these prophecies. Well, we're tracing the lineage of Jesus back all the way back to and through all of these promises. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God makes a covenant with David. He said, I will raise up your offspring after you and give them an eternal kingdom, and they will always be, he will always be on the throne. Your offspring will always be on the throne. Isaiah chapter 11 comes at a difficult time. How is it that David will have an eternal ancestor on the throne, but then Isaiah is also going to tell the people of Israel that they're about to be punished and carried off into exile? How do those two work together? Isaiah describes all of the nations of that area as trees. And he says they're all going to be cut down. You're looking at a beautiful forest, and very soon you will be looking at a field full of tree stumps. But then in Isaiah 11:1, I love this verse. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he goes on and continues to describe the Messiah to come. But he says, if you will look, after this is over, when all these trees in this great forest have been cut down, if you'll look closely, you will see Jesse. Now Jesse is David's father. And you'll see the root of Jesse, the stump of Jesse. And any of you who've ever been around trees that are cut down and you come back sometime later and there's a little sprout coming out to the side, he says you're going to see a little sprout come out to the side. And let me tell you about that sprout. There is still life, even though Judah is going to be cut down, there's still life there, and God is going to raise back up this tree from the stump of David. And he goes on to say that this tree is going to become mightier than any other tree that was ever in that forest to begin with. And so it's a beautiful prophecy about the Messiah coming from David and even coming out of the ashes of the deportation into Babylon. So that's the genealogy of the Messiah. What about the birth of the Messiah? Some of these you're going to recognize. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 tells us that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Micah chapter 5 verse 2 tells us that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 60 verse 6, one that you might not be familiar with, this is one that's a little more on the obscure level. So Micah chapter 5 verse 2 is very clear. Your king is coming out of Bethlehem. Your Messiah is coming out of Bethlehem. Very important, written after David. So well, maybe they're talking about David. David's dead and gone by the time Micah writes his prophecy. So the king is coming out of Bethlehem. Isaiah chapter 60 is a little more obscure, but it does speak of gold and frankincense being brought to the Messiah from other nations. It actually speaks of gold and frankincense being brought to God. And so that thought of these other nations coming and bringing gold and frankincense. Then there's the ministry of the Messiah. The Messiah would minister in Galilee. So Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1 through 2, you're probably familiar with this passage. In latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. So there is coming a great light to Galilee. And what's so interesting about that is that no one would have picked Galilee for the place of the Messiah's ministry. They would have chosen Jerusalem. That's where his ministry will be. That's where he'll rule over the nation. That's where he'll do everything God has said he's going to do. But his ministry was almost exclusively in Galilee. He made trips to Jerusalem, but he invested his ministry in Galilee. Then there is the prophecy that the Messiah would heal the blind, the deaf, the lame, and the mute. This is a description of the coming kingdom that God's going to rebuild after the exile. And so he describes it this way. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come to save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Now, it's important to just take a pause right here. Critics of these prophecies would say, well, he didn't really heal those people. Those were made up stories. Those were stories that were just made up to make Jesus sound better. But there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, when we read the actual stories of Scripture, Jesus' opponents never questioned his healings. They never said, well, he didn't heal anybody. His opponents said, he heals through demonic power. So they never questioned the healings. You know why they couldn't question the healings? There were so many of them. There were so many, they were so broadly attested, they happened in so many different places with so many different people, they could never really come back and say, well, he didn't heal these people, because there were so many people willing to say, well, he healed me. So the only thing they could do is attack him from a different angle and say, well, this must be the work of the devil. That's what Jesus said. That sin, that statement was what he said was the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. You're blaspheming the work of God. You're taking the work of God and you're attributing it to satanic power, and you are rejecting the Messiah. And here's the thing, they knew he was the Messiah and chose to reject him anyway. So that's one thing. Second thing, when you read the literature of the early church, when you read the debates they were in, you know the first debate about Jesus was not whether he was God or not. It's really interesting. The first debate about the nature of Jesus was whether he was a human or not. Gnosticism, we've talked a little bit about Gnosticism here. Gnosticism held the belief that Jesus was actually only appeared to be human. He was actually God, or a demigod, as they would have called him, but he was actually a divine being, but he was not human. He only appeared to be human. Why would they not be able to say that he wasn't God? Because of the well-attested record of all of the miracles that he did. His reputation, and those of you who have been to Galilee, those of you who have been to that region know, it's not something you can really hide. It's not something you can really get away with. It's not something you can really fake. It's a small town. If you grew up in a small town, tell me how long a miracle worker who claims to have healed maybe 50% of the people in the city, how long can he get away with that? Not very long. Everybody knows everything that goes on in a small town. I'll never forget, moved to a small town and I was living in a house owned by the church, and I was installing a French drain in my backyard, so I had a shovel and I was digging this trench out in the backyard, and I went to the bank. I walked in the door at the bank. I was going to open an account. I'd never walked into that bank before. I'd lived in the town all of about 1 week. I walked up and the lady said two things to me. She said, oh, we were wondering when you'd come down here. There was only one bank in town. Wondering when you'd come down and open an account. So, oh, well, I'm here to open an account. Did not know who this lady was. She was not a member of our church. And she said, we have been talking about this. What are you doing in your backyard? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you've been digging in your backyard, and we just wondered, what have you been doing in your backyard? And I said, oh, well, I'm installing a French drain. She said, oh, okay, well, we've just all been talking about it. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. That's how things work in a small town. Galilee is a small town. You don't get away with lying about all these things in Galilee. So they could not deny that he was God. The only way they could attack him was to say he wasn't actually a human. He just kind of appeared to be a human. So that was really the first heresy outside of the New Testament heresies that are dealt with. That's really the first one that they dealt with on a large scale. So the ministry of the Messiah, he's going to heal all these people. Then the Messiah would enter Jerusalem on a donkey. This is Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Rejoice, O greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he. Humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The triumphal entry, some have estimated that there would have been over 10,000 people as Jesus came into Jerusalem. Jerusalem would swell at that time of the year, at the time of the Passover, would swell to be a huge, massive city. Tens of thousands of people flooded in from outside of Jerusalem to be there for the feast of Passover. You can't lie about Jesus riding in on a donkey in Jerusalem on Passover or leading up to Passover in AD 30 or AD 33 if you're telling the story in AD 36 or AD 37. You can't get away with that because people are going to say, wait a second, I was there, I don't remember hearing anything about that. You mean to tell me that thousands of people flocked out there, that the Pharisees made a big deal out of it? I don't remember any of this. And although these stories weren't written down until later in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it would be somewhere around 20 years or so before they were written down, these stories were being told. These stories were being passed along. These stories didn't spring up out of thin air. They were being told from church to church to church. And so these stories are not things that were just made up. Now, a critic would say, well, of course he rode in on a donkey. He chose to ride in on a donkey so he could fulfill Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. That's why I said earlier, there has to be in some of the prophecies some obscurity. If not, then critics will simply say, well, he chose to live his life in such a way that it would match the prophecies. Well, now we get to the death of the Messiah. No one really chooses their manner of death. Well, most people don't, and certainly Jesus did not. Long before Roman crucifixion existed, the Bible tells us that the Messiah would be pierced. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 10, I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, notice the divine identity as well, on him whom they have pierced. How do you pierce God? You can't pierce God unless he becomes a man. So they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps for a firstborn. Then Psalm 22, and I do want you to turn there. Psalm chapter 22 describes the Messiah's death in pretty good detail. So Psalm 22 is the psalm that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is important to remember that they didn't have chapter and verses the way that we do when Jesus was walking the earth. So the way to refer to Psalm 22 is actually to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? So when Jesus says that on the cross, I think he's doing two things. Number one, I think he's saying, God has forsaken me, meaning that I'm going to die. God has forsaken me. He's not going to rescue me. I think he's doing that. But I think he's also referencing Psalm 22 so that those who are around him, and then us later, would look back and see the description of his own death in Psalm 22. So knowing what you know about the death of Jesus, let's look at Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. You are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted, and they were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. And then if you want to skip on down to verse 12. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like ravening and roaring lions. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So you see in Psalm 22 so many elements of the crucifixion of Jesus. There's one that I want to point out that you might not immediately think of. In verse 14 he says, my heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. Some people believe that the reason Jesus' side had blood and water flow out of it is that either his organs had liquefied or that he had such a bad case of congestive heart failure. Don't picture a trained Roman soldier, by the way. Don't picture a trained Roman soldier doing what you and I would do with a spear. If somebody told us to go stab someone with a spear, we would take it and we would stab it right in their side because we're not trained Roman soldiers. That's no Roman soldier. A Roman soldier is going to put the spear right up under that rib cage and he's going to aim right for the heart. especially on the ground as Jesus hangs on the cross. So some believe that when the reason blood and water flowed out of that wound is that he pierced the fluid sac that was around the heart of Jesus, that Jesus was experiencing congestive heart failure. And so if so, then that's a very literal fulfillment of that Psalm 22:14. So the Messiah's death is described in Psalm 22 from a physical standpoint. It's described somewhat in Isaiah 53 from a physical standpoint, but added to it is the nature of his substitutionary death. So long before the theology of substitutionary atonement, long before that early Christian statement that is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Christ died for our sins, Isaiah chapter 53 predicts that he would do just that. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one who from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. We esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced. That's the third reference we have read to him, to the Messiah being pierced. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So many detailed descriptions of the way that Jesus died. And yes, some of those elements could have been made up by his followers and maybe slipped into the story, but the crucifixion process is not determined by the followers of Jesus. It is determined by the Romans. And so when the Romans crucify Jesus, they're the ones who are piercing him. They're the ones who are treating him the way that they're treating him. They're the ones who are casting lots for his clothing. That was something they did with crucifixion victims. They would cast lots for their clothing. So this is not only something they did with Jesus. Now, to be clear, this is not something that I'm aware of, that there's any historical record that they did when Psalm 22 was written, casting lots for their clothes, but it was something that the Romans did involving crucifixion victims. Well, what about the resurrection and ascension of the Messiah? Just a couple of quick passages about the resurrection, and then the ascension actually is in one of the next passages. The Messiah would not be abandoned to death. So Psalm chapter 16, verse 10, David says of the one to come, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor let your Holy One see corruption." You're not going to let his body corrupt. You're not going to let it go to death. Then the Messiah would be crushed as an offering, yet still have prolonged days. So if we were to continue reading in Isaiah 53, we'd get to verse 10. "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." So the Lord will both crush him and will at the same time prosper his days. Then there's the kingdom of the Messiah, and this includes that prophecy about his ascension. Really, one of the other most incredible prophecies to me is listed here for you. First of all, the Messiah would come from Israel and would rule over other nations. This is one of the things that made Israel such a threat to the nations around them. It's why they hired a prophet, Balaam, to speak out against the nation, to prophesy against them, to bring some kind of curse on them. Well, in the process of doing that, he actually prophesies about Jesus. Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." And then Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has a vision that no good, godly Jewish man would create on his own. Daniel has a vision of a man. He calls him a son of man. Now you need to understand, we connect that title to Jesus. But before it was connected to Jesus, it just simply meant a human, a son of man. From Daniel forward, it's no longer a son of man, it's the Son of Man. So this Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 takes on its own identity, and people start to wonder, who could this Son of Man be? Because what Daniel's going to say here is that he sees a human walk up to the throne of God and have the authority to take from God a kingdom that he will rule over. Now, what human can do that? What good Jewish godly prophet would dare say that a human would walk up to the throne of God? Well, only a prophet who actually saw this happen. In other words, this is not something Daniel would make up. So, Daniel says in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 through 14, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, in his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So Daniel, now just think, just rewind in history to before understanding that Jesus is God in the flesh. And think about Jewish theology, and think about all you know about Jewish prophets and all you know about the law. Would a Jewish prophet ever say these things about a human? Would a Jewish prophet ever say that he approaches the Ancient of Days, that he comes to the throne of the Ancient of Days, that he takes from the Ancient of Days a kingdom that is an everlasting kingdom, and that all the nations would serve him? No, that is language reserved only for God. Yet in this moment, Daniel says, I'm telling you, I saw a human, a son of man, go and do this. It disturbed Daniel. The vision disturbed Daniel greatly. And it wasn't until Jesus, and it wasn't until his ascension, where the book of Hebrews says that he is seated at the right hand of God, which means in some ways that he is sharing the throne of God with him. It wasn't until that New Testament, that revelation of Jesus, that we all understood what it was that Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 7. So, like I said, over 300 prophecies. We've only scratched the surface. These are prophecies. These don't include the typologies and the many other things of the Hebrew Scriptures. They all point to Jesus. Every single part of the Hebrew Scriptures point forward to Jesus. They leave a massive gaping hole without Jesus, and Jesus fulfills everything in every way so that the puzzle piece perfectly fits where the Old Testament leaves the blank spaces.